Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Richard Smith here on behalf of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, and I am delighted to be here today with Neil Howe, the author of The Fourth Turning is Here, and Ben Hunt, the founder of Epsilon Theory. Neil, Ben, it's fantastic to be with you guys. Thank you so much for joining us today. I've really been looking forward to this conversation for a long time, and delighted to have you both here.
Well, thank you, Richard.
Likewise, Richard. My pleasure.
And thank you, Ben, for setting this up. You know, this came about because of your Epsilon Connect event, which I attended, and we finally met in person there. Neil, you were going to come, but you had been under the weather. So I see this as kind of a continuation of Epsilon Connect, Ben.
I like that. I like that sensibility to it. That's perfect.
And this is a topic. Neil, your book, I've been reading it very carefully. It's a wonderful book. I really got a lot more out of it than I was expecting to get out of it. It's a lot deeper and more substantive. This is a reflection on me, but I just sort of thought before reading this book that The Fourth Turning was like yours and Bill Strauss's idea, right? But when I read this book, I was really surprised and pleased to see like how rooted your work is in the work of others. There's kind of a continuum of work that has led to this, and how deep it is that you go into history and really kind of flesh out these ideas that you've outlined here.
Yeah. Yes. You know what? I often remind people that Bill and I started working on this in the late 80s. It's a long time. We met in New York City briefly. We were both working for Pete Peterson. He was at, I think, Lehman Brothers at the time. But we met, and then later on, when I was in D.C., we joined, and we wanted to write a book together on generations of American history. And it's interesting at that point, Richard, that we had no real interest in cycles. That was not really what we were looking for, right?
Right.
We were just interested in how generations are shaped differently by how they're raised, by their location in history young, and how they then shape history, as they get older, as leaders and parents. And throughout our study of looking at this sequence going way back, the seasonality or the cyclicality just struck us, right? I mean, it was so striking, and we could not overlook that. And so when we finally went to the publisher, which I think was William Morrow at the time, I think they'd been absorbed by, one of the, I think Bertelsmann or Penguin, they've been absorbed since. But we reframed it as a cycle approach to American history. So it was simultaneous. It was a cycle approach, but it was also the first time anyone had written a history of America written as a sequence of generational biographies. It was amazing to us that no one had written that before. In other words, taking the experiences of each group who came of age at a particular era.
Yeah.
There came of age during a war or were children during a war, had some distinctive relationship to the events of their time that marked them off from the people just older or just younger. No one had written that, and that really amazed us. And it was in the process of doing that the cycle sort of manifested itself to us.
That's fantastic. And obviously, being the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, I could talk all day about cycles, how you've kind of articulated the cycles, but also how you've explained the cycles. I hope we can do another session on that sometime. What I really wanted to get into today was kind of, since we've got you and we've got Ben together, and I regard you both as chroniclers of the crisis of our time, right? You've both been very influential on me, on my thinking, and you're both really, I think, articulating uniquely what we're going through today. So I really wanted to spend our time together talking about what we're going through today, bring in, of course, some of the cyclical work, the generational work, but really focus on where we're at today, what we're going through, what's this going to look like, what are some different scenarios, and what does it look like when we come out on the other side? So that work for you guys?
Yeah.
Right on.
All right. So I just wanted to briefly, before we get into the thick of it, introduce you guys to our founder, Edward Dewey. So he founded the foundation in 1941, which is just about a saeculum ago, Neil. 84.
Yes.
80, and he was the chief economist in the Hoover administration at the time, and he had been tasked by President Hoover to figure out what caused the Depression. And he talked to 100 different economists and got 100 different answers, and ended up going down a path of cycles. And he connected it to natural cycles. He went to a big conference in Canada called the Metamac Conference, met Copley Amory, who co-founded the foundation, and just started to connect economic cycles with natural cycles. And when the foundation was established, it had the head of the Smithsonian, a couple of professors from Yale and Harvard, the head of the Canadian Northwest Territories, all these different, influential figures who are interested in cycles. And so I'm working on building and reviving the foundation. We are a not-for-profit. Harriman House just agreed to republish Dewey's book, Cycles, the Mysterious Forces That Trigger Events. That's the cover there. So in March of 2024, they're going to be publishing his classic book in their Harriman Definitive Edition series. So reminiscences.
That's great. Congratulations.
In there and others.
Yeah, that is great.
Very excited about that. And, there's so much interest in cycles today between you, Ray Dalio, Peter Turchin, George Friedman, and others, right? And I'm looking forward to people getting familiar with Dewey's work again. So with that preamble, let's jump into it. I tapped into my newfound artistic capabilities here.
Kind of new age, Richard.
ChatGPT and DALL-E. So this is an image I created in ChatGPT plus DALL-E, which I thought was relevant, to something going on in our world. That's part of the story that we're in the midst of right now. To just give you a little framework here for introducing your turnings, Neil. So I hope this helps and doesn't take away, but maybe you could introduce us to the idea of these periods of history, seasons of history.
If this is coming off AI, I assume I can just copy it without paying you. Is that right,
yes,
Richard?
I'm happy to give it to you.
Okay. I'm alive to every opportunity here. No, it looks nice. So the one thing, I'm glad I gave the preamble on sort of generations, because the one thing that we noticed is that generations came in a certain order. That is to say, certain kinds of generations followed other kinds of generations. And that's because these generations tended to follow a pattern in history, right? In other words, a generation tends to come of age in one era. The next generation tends to come of age in a sequentially different era. One thing that historians have noticed for a long time is that there are huge civic upheavals in our history, going back to the late 17th century, which occur about once every long human lifetime, somewhere between 80 and 100 years. And recently, it's really been between about 80 and 90 years, right? And that was the Glorious Revolution crisis, or I say crises. There were many of them in the late 17th century. A lifetime later, the American Revolution. A lifetime later, the Civil War. A lifetime later, the New Deal and World War II, and then here we are, right? And roughly halfway in between these crises in the outer world, when we're refixing infrastructure, politics, the economy, and community, we have the great awakenings of American history, when we refix the inner world of values, culture, language, music, and particularly religion. Obviously, this is what we call, we're very, ever since boomers came around, we're very used to the word values in America. Boomers have made that, very, very famous. And that's not surprising because they came of age during an awakening, right? You see it right here, 1964 to 1984. That's when they came of age. So this is the most recent iteration of the pattern, right? You have the crisis, that's there, and then you have the awakening. That's basically your spring and your winter, and in between those we have, these are kind of the solstices, but in between that you have sort of the equinoxes, these transitional seasons. After the crisis, you enter a high. That's a period when institutions are strong, individualism is weak, everyone is fearing a recursion back into the crisis. So we all get along very well with each other. We're modest as individuals, but we think ourselves titanic as a community, and we're able to solve huge community problems. And to the children who are growing up in that era, I think their attitude is we oversolve those problems. We do too much to solve those problems. So that gives rise to the great rebellion, the great revolution, the turning inward of the awakening, the focusing on faith rather than works, the turning inward to the heart, right? And I think you saw that during the awakening on both the left and the right. This was bipartisan. I think on the left, it was mainly a repudiation of traditional rules regarding gender and seniority and hierarchy, social hierarchy, and so on, rules about dress and language and everything else, right? Just get all that social discipline off my back. And I think on the right, it was mainly the deregulatory and tax cut movement, which really kicked in toward the end of that period, which was, again, liberation of the self. And I think liberation of the self is the leitmotif of these eras, going back in history. And then that gives rise to the unraveling, which is much the opposite of a high. In the unraveling, individualism is strong, institutions are weak, civic authority also tends to be weak. Famous decades of the unraveling tend to be decades of cynicism and bad manners. These would be the roaring 90s or the roaring 20s or the 1850s, when the country just really didn't feel it had any center at all, or the 1760s. And history teaches that these periods of sort of pervasive individualism, where giving free rein of individualism is often regarded in these eras as the kind of the end of history, to use Francis Fukuyama's famous phrase that became very popular in the late 1990s. But history teaches that these unravelings ultimately end in crises, when instead of taking apart institutions because people don't want them anymore, because there's less demand for order, right? So that we begin, society begins supplying less order. In the crisis, we begin going the other way. And it's almost really an inflection point when suddenly society begins demanding more order, right? And you can see that, by the way, I think not just in the United States, certainly, but around the world. And in fact, I do think that this cycle has become, and the generational cycle itself has become global. We can talk more about that if you want, but we see this trend toward, authoritarian populist leaders bent on simplifying everything down to some core ethnocentric idea that will reimpose order and make everyone very certain of what's going to happen in their own communities in so many areas of the world, right?
And in some ways, it's because we're longing for order after all of the disorder and unraveling that we've experienced over the past few decades.
It's a yin and yang, and I look
the yin and yang definitely came to mind as an image there. Between the crisis and awakening.
Yeah, boomers hated the order of the high. They hated the middle class. They hated the fact that inequality was so low. Why were we all so homogeneous and conformist? Now
they've got their inequality today, huh?
Well, exactly. A strong middle class, little boxes, all made it ticky tacky, was a great triumph for their parents' generation. They thought this was a much better world.
Right.
Boomers hated it. That was Pleasant Valley Sunday. That was charcoal burning everywhere. That was like the worst nightmare. And now you see millennials, I talk to them, and you tell them about these little modest houses that all look the same, and everyone could afford them. And they say, "Where is it? I want to sign up."
Give me that.
You can't find them anymore. And I have to tell them, well, we boomers just got rid of it. We couldn't stand those things. And you see, that is the yin and yang, right? I mean, here's a generation that wants order. They want simple things that equalize, that bring us together, and that work, right? That are functional.
Yeah. So Ben, does this line up with your, are you buying into this structure, this thesis, and does it line up with your work?
Well, sure. It's like Hemingway famously said when he was talking about religions. He said it's all true, right? There's no doubt that what I'll call it a cyclical view of history and our present is true. I want to add to this, though, I think a complementary truth, which is, I came at this from a slightly different perspective. I was a member of the high church of academia, right? So I was a tenured professor in political science, of all oxymorons, right? And at the core of this notion that politics is a science that can be, measured, and that it is all measurable, it means that really, political science is this weird offspring of history on the one hand, and economics on the other. And I bring this up because it's reflective of the two great tensions, the two great strands of thought within political science. The first is, goes under the name of realism, but that's cycle theory, right? The notion of realism in trying to understand how politics and power works is at its core that there is a repeating cycle to history. And it's reflected in ideas which I absolutely agree, that everything you need to know about political science, at least international relations, you can learn by reading Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. And I actually truly believe that. Mm-hmm. Right. The other perspective, and it really comes more from economics, and I'll describe why, is the notion that there is an arrow to history. And for most, right, they believe that arrow goes up and to the right. So this would be expressed in small L liberalism. So Adam Smith, right, there is an arrow to history. There are aspects that are cyclical and repeat themselves over and over again, but there's an up and to the right arrow to history. Mm-hmm. Karl Marx, the same way, right? There's an arrow that also describes human history and development. So, my kind of background was thinking about, all right, I want to believe in that small L liberal up and to the right arrow for human history. And I think that's most often expressed by people who look at either economics, standard of living, and also technology, right? Those are the typical vectors that one looks at for that arrow.
Yes. Well said.
And then, but at the same time, right, I started my career in political science very much on the economics side of this, the math. I was the science side of political science. Mm-hmm. And as I get older, and it's not just being the grumpy grandpa, it is, I swear, it is recognizing the cyclical aspect to history, right? That you see more, and that the arrow, if there is an arrow, and I gotta believe there is, that's my faith, it's not a straight arrow. right? But what does seem to be constant to me is the cycles, right? So the way I would like to view it is that human history is that of a cycle, I hope, following an arc, an arrow.
Moving down the arrow of time.
Right. And hopefully up and to the right, right? In terms of the things that matter to me.
Yep.
What I find so challenging in that vision of cycles within a impetus to history is placing it in the now, right? And I've had this conversation with Neil. It's one of the things I admire so much about Neil's book, that he puts down real markers here. And he's also, I think, appropriately agnostic about the path one takes from where we are now, the fourth turning, that crisis phase, into what's next. And it's optimistic, right there. This is the great thing about a cycle. There is another season. It will come.
Right.
But not Pollyanna-ish about it, right? So the path there, and then what is on the other side, is by no means determined. Yeah. So that's one of the things I like so much, and that's what I'd kind of like to ask both of you about. And I'll ask it in this way: another author that I just love, because I think I read more science fiction these days than I do history, is and I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Cixin Liu, the author of the Three-Body Problem, the Three-Body Trilogy. And so if you're familiar with it, you'll recognize what I'm about to say, but it's the Three-Body Problem. It's near-term science fiction. There's another civilization that discovers Earth and is coming to wipe us out. Right? That's the basic idea. And it's humanity trying to defend itself, et cetera, et cetera. So it's telling the story of one of these defenders. And it gets to a point in the story where, it's going to take like 200 years before the next level is to play out. Because it takes a long time for the Trisolaran fleet to make its way to us. It takes a long time. So he wants to, fortunately, in science fiction, they've discovered suspended animation. And so the protagonist here says, well, not much is going to happen in terms of the alien invasion for, call it 200 years. Things are looking pretty tough here on Earth, politically, crisis-wise, and the like. I think I'll just go to sleep. So, and in science fiction, this works. 200 years later, he's woken up. The nurse or technician who wakes him up, she on her clothing, she's wearing these different medals and insignia of the things that happened over that intervening 200 years. As the world apparently went through a terrible series of crises, terrible, political outcomes, only to fortunately keep the people in suspended animation alive and then awake them, 200 years later. Cixin Liu, the author of the Three-Body Problem, does not talk about those intervening 200 years, other than to note they happened, and a lot of weird stuff happened, right? But the technician, everybody there, simply refers to that period of time as the Great Ravine. The Great Ravine. And I'm using that as the title of a note, because what strikes me right now, trying to put, as you mentioned, Richard, put this in the context of the now, of course I buy into this, right? I mean, history is one of cycles. I have faith that, it's over a long enough period of time, it's an arrow up and to the right also. But I also recognize that arrow is not steadily up and to the right, and particularly at this point in history, we enter a period that's always a great ravine. And it just was so striking to me that I think so many writers, and I find myself doing the same thing. I'm kind of waving my hand at and say, can we get through this already? Right? Can we just get over the Great Ravine? But this is what we're dealing with, right? We are actually starting the Great Ravine,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't have insight into what that looks at. So that's the frustrating part to me, right? It's not on a theory or structure part. It's what the hell is the Great Ravine going to be, and we can't go into suspended animation.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, and what lies at the other side of it? And why can't we know what lies at the other side of it? What I think is that there's a reason why we can't know. And that is, if we knew that cycle was a spiral upward, right, then we wouldn't be motivated to act. The entire thing would collapse. This is what I constantly point out. It's society goes through a rite of passage. It's exactly like an individual or a generation, right? We do learn from history, yes, but we don't learn from history by reading about it. We learn from history by living it. That's how we learn from history. And I hate to say it, but humans are not terribly cerebral creatures. We learn by experiencing things, and that changes us forever. That makes us different. We don't learn from reading about it. With all due respect for all the great, Santayana and all the great historians who said that we need to learn from history. Yeah, we do, but we can't do it by reading about it. We have to live it, and that's what created the post-war American high, and I said the post-war global high of peace and prosperity that lasted for decades, because you had an entire generation that lived through it, and it changed who they were, right? And they dominated public life, by the way, until all the way into the 1990s, right? Many of them, right? So this is how it happens. In a rite of passage, and we see this with the Amazonian tribes. A young male is led into the jungle, and they're taken up on a giant tree, and a vine is tied to their ankle. Right, this is sort of like an ultimate bungee jump, but they don't know if that vine is going to break or not, and they're pushed off. Right, and that's the rite of passage. And it changes them for life, right? That is that adrenaline-soaked moment in which you become a different person. And when you come back to your village, you no longer go back to live with your mother and father. You know what I mean? You're introduced to a whole new community. You become a different person. You're referred to with different names. I mean, everything about your identity has changed, right? But that's how history works. If we knew that it was going to end well, then it wouldn't transform us. That is the paradox of it, right? We need to fear that it could all be over, because, of course, it could all be over, in order to truly change us. Does that make sense?
And Neil, I'll go farther. I mean, we can look at plenty of historical examples where the transition has not gone well.
Oh, totally, yes. That always reminds us.
And, we just have to look at, 20th century totalitarian regimes. And,
well, look at Russia from 1914 to 1946. I mean, you're talking about excess deaths, to use the demographer's word, right, of tens of millions of people. I mean, extraordinary, right? Extraordinary bad outcome for a fourth term.
Yeah, exactly
right. Ben, you have a wonderful community over at Epsilon Theory.
Thank you.
Fantastic forum where a lot of interesting conversations take place. I participate in a lot of them. And one of the things that was said recently by one of the contributors, Desperate Yuppie, he has a way with words, but he called it a beautiful flaw. This tension that we have between kind of not knowing the future but knowing something about the past. I love the way you put it about kind of the arrow of history versus the cycles of history. And that ultimately, we're not going to have the answer ahead of time, right? And that things can go wrong. Bad things can happen. And that in the end, I just love the way that idea of a beautiful flock, right? That these aren't poles that we can hit each other over the head with, depending on which side of the arrow of history or the cycles of history that we're on. And that there is this kind of yin and yang aspect to it.
100%, Richard. I mean, this is the human condition, right?
Yeah,
I mean, this
absolutely.
is it. This is it. And I was thinking kind of ways to take the conversation from here. And one of the things that continues to strike me, and I'd love to explore it with the two of you, is just what Neil was saying earlier about what comes in after the fourth turning. That there is that community looms large in the first turning, right after this. What comes next, and that individualism is diminished and reduced. Which, let's be clear. I mean, is that not just the polar opposite of what we have today? At least that's what it seems to me, where the role of community is, vanishingly small, and the lionization of individuals is, just crazily prominent. And so I've been trying to think about, well, what are the experiences, to use Neil's description, which I think is spot on. What is the lived history that we as individuals, as a people, would have to experience in order to flip on its head our current elevation of the individual, diminishment of the community, to the other way around? And I'll leave aside Neil's other very good point, which is that, it's not like one of these situations is by definition great and wonderful and the other's not, right? It depends what kind of community, values you're elevating and what individual aspects you're diminishing, right? We can imagine, and we've seen plenty of societies where that's gone horribly awry. And even in, the United States, it can kind of become stultifying and lead to an awakening. But right now, during this great ravine period, what do we have to experience such that our commitment to community and the values of communityness, what has to happen for them to be elevated?
And do we have to kill each other or not?
That's the point, Richard, because I think of fighting, of organized political violence as one of the paths to which community becomes elevated. I would love for us to imagine and put the words to alternative paths. Because if there's one thing I know from studying language, which is my beat, is that if we don't have the words for something, we cannot think that thing. So I would like for us to try to think of that thing, right? That is some path other than organized political violence to get us to a world where community values are elevated rather than diminished.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have a part in my book, I believe it's chapter 8, I can't recall, but I think it is, where I have a discussion of William James's speech at Stanford University called The Moral Equivalent of War. And he raised exactly what you're asking. Is it possible to have an event which motivates people to reestablish community in all of that adrenaline-soaked sense, which actually changes us, without war?
Yep.
And I'll tell you, I've read that essay many times. I've been really intrigued by it, and I'm intrigued by his observations. And he sounds less than convinced.
Yes, he certainly was less than convinced. And I am less than convinced also. It's just, I think it's the most important thing, right? And look, William James, pragmatism, education, right? The kind of, and it's.
And he did have that point in his speech where he asked, I thought the most fascinating moment in his speech where he pauses and he asks the audience, and he said, all of these advantages of war, it actually gets people to care about their fellow person, to sacrifice for the community, to invest in big institutions, we couldn't imagine the kind of modern, progressive, affluent society we had, he said, without these experiences. And then he finally asked his audience, would anyone here have preferred that America had not fought the Civil War? Of course, the most disastrous conflict, in terms of human cost per capita that America has fought. And he answers his own questions. I'm sure none of you would. All of you are thankful that we had the Civil War because we couldn't imagine that kind of sense of progress, industrialization, the affluent, right? He was speaking to this, many of whom had been through the Civil War. And of course, he was speaking in that particular instance, the same hymnal as people of the same age, like Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and so on, who had been wounded many times in that war. But they couldn't imagine. But then he asked another question. He said, but that's the paradox of war. He said, how many of you would like to go through another experience like that, 5 years from now? And of course, none of you would. You would always say, no, let's not do it now. And my analogy here is exactly the way we look in our personal lives. You ask someone who, almost everyone has gone through terrible experiences in their lives, right? They've lost a spouse, they've gone through a family tragedy, their business has gone bankrupt, something horrible has happened, and you ask them, that happened 5 or 10 years ago for you, would you have preferred that you had never gone through that? And I've done that with many people, and most of them will tell me on reflection, no, I actually became a better person. I became more focused, I became deeper, I became wiser. I really know better what life is about, having been through that. I don't want to go back to what I was before. But of course, then you ask him, do you want to go another experience like that tomorrow? And of course, no one does, right? I have enough wisdom. I'm good. I'm good.
I'm good.
One of my
isn't that very similar, Ben? It's the same. It's the same paradox.
I wonder. One of the things I've thought about is if we can kind of express this conflict in cyberspace, right? Maybe this metaverse world is William James's, what's the phrase that he used, Neil? The
it's
moral equivalent, right?
Yeah, the moral equivalent of
so
war.
I get it. This is wishful thinking. I don't really believe this, but I do think in some way we are playing out the conflict in a less violent way, right? And then let me just take it to a real science fiction level. But what if we end up having a battle with AI? And humanity kind of unites against AI. So, I know it sounds ridiculous, and it is ridiculous, but I think there's something to it in that, I believe that the creation of AI is ultimately going to show us something about what really makes us human.
So let me jump in on this, Richard, because the idea of having a common enemy is, I think, generally, whether it's in fiction or in history, mm-hmm. something that does change the trajectory of how one goes through a great ravine. Yep. Neil and I have had this conversation a couple of times. If you went back to the mid 30s in the United States, and you ask people, where is the conflict, the organized political violence going to come from?
Right.
It wasn't going to be, we're going to be fighting a war with, Japan and Germany. It was that, we're going to be fighting a war right here in the United States. Right? There's going to be domestic political conflict. So there is a notion that an other, provides that unifying crucible, right, for community, and unfortunately that is typically expressed in organized political violence.
Right.
You see this in fiction as well. So again, I guess I'm the resident comic book and science fiction guy.
Yeah.
But there's the Alan Moore's fantastic series called Watchmen.
Yep.
How does Ozymandias, the smartest man in the world, how does he plan to unify humanity? By creating a common alien enemy, right? And so I appreciate what you're saying, Richard, about if only we have a common enemy, it brings us together, and that's what elevates community. I got to tell you though, and this was the greatest personal disappointment to me about America's experience and also the world's experience with COVID, right? So here's a virus, here's an external enemy. I thought it would unify us. I did.
Great point.
And I was totally wrong.
Yeah.
It did not unify us at all. It only exacerbated the polarization that we have in society, often demarcated, but not always by red and blue political tribal lines. So I have been so sympathetic to this idea of finding that common struggle, not war, hopefully, but a common struggle. And I really thought that COVID would be that, and I was so wrong.
All
so
right.
that's kind of my take on the other as
and in some way, remember, you can be unified in different ways. Remember how we were unified in the early 1860s, right? So in a sense, COVID as a stressor did unify both sides in America, red zone and blue zone. And keep in mind that the unification of community does not necessarily mean that only one community in the United States.
Well put. Well put, Neil. You're absolutely right there. I can't come back to that. My desires, what I want to be true, is the community. The community ideals that are elevated is the ideals of being an American. Right.
But you have but we have no guarantee of that. And in fact, I spend a fair amount of that book talking about the different ways it could go. It could be America against the world. It could be different parts of America against each other. And we have abundant historical precedents for either one or both at the same time or even overlapping. And I kind of go through those scenarios, right?
So, Neil, if I can, I've got some slides on that too, and I would like to continue to leverage your structure, keeping this question in mind that Ben has raised. And so I think it'll help us to, continue to get even more specific. Okay. So I'm going to skip over the generational archetypes here, but I just want to share my art again.
Wow.
ChatGPT's art. And I do, I would love to talk about this because I think it's very important, but this is the basic idea that each kind of turning has a kind of archetypal generation that's in its youth, in the 20 to 40-year-old range, and plays a certain role and kind of takes on an identity which sticks with that generation for the rest of its life, right? The prophets during the awakening, those are the boomers. The nomads during the unraveling, the lost generation and Gen X, that's me. The heroes during the crisis, the GIs and the millennials, and then the artists during the high, the silence, and the Gen Zs. So this is a big part of your work. I don't think we're going to get into it that much today, but in addition, we're not going to get into this either, but this is something very important, Neil, where you kind of take this seasons of time, right? The unraveling, the crisis, the high, the awakening, the unraveling, etc., along with the seasons of life, the elderhood, the midlife, young adults, and youth. And then you told another interviewer, Adam Taggart, tracking of generational attitudes and behaviors across turnings is even more valuable than demographics. And
look,
that was very interesting. And again, something we probably don't have a lot of time to delve into today, but this seems like a very important idea in your work of how, these kind of age groups move through the different turnings and relate to one another in each turning.
It is. And, I sometimes call myself a demographer. I mean, my graduate degrees are in history and economics. But, it's a little bit of a shift there to demography. I think we'll include that. But demography is mainly, of course, about fertility, mortality, migration, morbidity, all that kinds of stuff. It's very quantitative. You can crank out the numbers using pretty good assumptions. And I will say this about conventional classical demography. If there is one of the very few things we know about the year 2040, absent an alien invasion of some kind or something like that, is how many people will be alive and in what age bracket. I mean, it is amazing. It's like one of the few things we actually have a very good bead
We
on,
do have an answer for that one.
Yeah, we have an answer. Not a lot of things we have an answer. But there is something else about that I like to remind people. Very often when you see science fiction, and I point that out again and again, and I hope I deliver on that a little bit in the book when I talk about what the first turning is going to be like in the late 2030s, 2040s. And that is very often when we look at America, say, in the mid-2040s, right? Most people think that is a sci-fi scenario. And you read a book about it, you see a movie about it, and like everyone's different, like everything's different. All the people are different. We're like a different place. And we seldom recognize that world is going to be all of us, just older. I mean, it's not like an alien world. It's just going to be all of us, but older. And it's going to be even the kids are going to be raised by people we already know. So we even know something about how the kids will be raised because we already know the parents, right? So this is my point: is that world is not just we know how many of them there will be at every age. We also know something about who they are, to the extent that behaviors and attitudes stay constant over the life cycle. And one thing we know about the cohort effect is that it is surprisingly stable. I mean, for example, this is kind of one of your classical lessons on this is that the dominant popular political party, between the time a generation is between 16 and 17 and mid-20s, right? So late teens, mid-20s. Becomes that generation's favorite party, typically for the rest of its life, right? And we've seen that again and again throughout history. Why don't we pay attention to this? Now, there are many other examples as well. In the book that Bill and I wrote, Generations, we that was what I think probably the first real description of the millennial generation, who were in 1991, where the oldest of them were only 8 years old, right? So they were these little babies on board with their, with these super protected kids. And we laid down a number of predictions about what this generation would be like. And anyone who wants can go back to that book and look. We said they were going to be regarded as very special. They were going to be extremely protected as they grow older. They would be risk averse. They would bring down rates of crime. They would bring down rates of risk taking. They would be community oriented, right? They would be very peer oriented. We hadn't yet developed, there would be another 20 years before anyone said FOMO, but fear of missing out would be a huge part of what millennials would become. But we went down point by point what this generation would be like. Okay, that was a hero archetype. If you look at this chart, And we were predicting what they would be like as young adults, right?
I think on the next chart, this is again from your book, right?
Yes.
But here, so let's just look at the crisis here, because that's what we're talking about, that you have this kind of structure. Let's say this is today millennials, who are entering youth during the crisis. So these are the Gen Zs, right? The artist group, and then millennials would be here playing the hero role.
This is through
Gen
the
Z
unraveling.
kind of,
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That would be Gen Zs
and that
today.
gives a lot of, I think, structure to potentially work with, to dive a little deeper into trying to tease apart, the future. It's not just one monolithic person going through this crisis. It's at least 4 generations going through the crisis, all with different histories and different perspectives.
It's the idea of a paradigm. And the silent generation, I say suffocated, because of course in the rest of their life they were doing everything they could to open up America, just open up all these close confines of their life, from Woody Allen to Daniel Ellsberg, just to get secrets out and to open things up, to Judy Blume, who never wanted to protect her children because they should see real life for what it really, it was really like battling to come out of the closet. And then I see today's kids, we call them homelanders, but I can talk to a 13 or 14-year-old today, even a 15-year-old, and they will tell me there was never a single moment in their life when their parents did not know exactly where they were. Exactly where they were. We're not tracking them and knew where they were. And I'm thinking, what do you call that?
And I've even seen some stories where I've seen stories where they invite that, right?
Well, they do.
Not just their parents, it's them. They want to be tracked.
The Silent did the same thing. Shirley Temple was delighted that parents paid so much attention to her and that, were fawning all over her. But it was a very distinct way of being raised.
Right.
It wasn't that the kids didn't like it. By the time you get to the prophet archetype, now they're not going to like it very much. So, that's going to be the difference, right?
Yeah.
So
good.
It is a way, I think, to come back to your original question, Richard, I do think that this is another kind of demography, is what I'm suggesting. It's not just the demography of predicting numbers. It's the demography of predicting attitudes and behaviors that will age with cohorts. Now, of course, these cohorts will get older. And as they get older, they will encounter completely new life problems, like getting married and buying a house and choosing a career. And of course, that will change them. I'm not saying that they will stay the same. They will grow. And there will be a phase of life effect as they grow older. No question about that. But how they approach those new phase of life challenges will always bear the imprint, right, of their archetype. And I think this is a different way of looking at history. It is not unknown to social scientists to look at what we call the cohort effect. And social scientists look at that all the time. They have fancy statistical ways of trying to measure it. But what I'm calling for is more a whole approach where we look at all of the implications of that cohort effect and group these into generational units.
What I appreciate about this, one of the things I appreciate about it is that it helps me realize that my own experience of the crisis isn't the same thing that the other cohorts are experiencing as well.
Exactly. Right. Very well put. The way today's kids will remember what we're going through today will be very different from the way millennials will remember it, and very different from the way Xers, and very different from the way boomers are now actually looking at it. It will mean something different to them.
Ben, any comments on this? Or
no, only that I find that this I experience with my own children, in talking with them about current events. They do experience this differently.
Yep.
I think there are other, I'll call it this generational aspect, which I think has been largely underserved until Neil and Bill really took a crack at it. I think what is also true, right, is that there are other demographic aspects, race and gender, among them,
Sure.
which
Yeah.
also shape attitudes.
Absolutely.
But there's so much, class being another one, right? But those are the demographic attributes that I think get a lot of play. And what I think is really valuable about Neil's work is this is also a change in the way of, again, I'll go back to kind of language. Each of these generations tells different stories about the world. Each of these generations tells a different story to themselves about their role in the world. And it's that storytelling and the way that we can describe it as, oh, this is the story of a prophet, right? This is the story of a nomad. And we all know what that means, right? It's that storytelling and the way the stories are shaped and change over time. That's where I find that there's so much still to be explored in this framework. And that's what excites me.
And let me say one other thing about generations, which is unique for social categories, is that they're mortal. They age, they die. They have their own timetable. This is not true of class and race and all of these. Those things are just abstract and they're timeless. They don't have a timetable built into them. What I like about generations, they have a timetable built into them.
That's a great
point. What I mean? They are going to go through these phases of life, these life problems at predictable ages. You can set your watch to it, and that creates the opportunity for a kind of forecasting that's not available with the other things. Because as these generations age, they're going to predictably change the social mood in ways that will influence how we see those other issues. For instance, diversity in America, racial, ethnic, or otherwise. I was reminded not long ago that sometime in the late 1990s, when I think it was Al Gore, when he was vice president, was saying, e pluribus unum, it's a great motto of America. It means from one, we get this great diversity. And I was thinking, someone had to correct him. No, that's actually the opposite.
Yeah, it's actually the opposite. Right.
But isn't it typical that in unraveling, that's how we would interpret it, right? From one, we get great diversity. And of course, today, in a fourth turning, we're more worried about the unity. How do we get back to a unity, right? I mean, no one's really celebrating diversity today in the same way, because we realize, I think adrenaline is now flowing in America about the danger of loss of community. I think it's reached the point where we do feel that unity is our number one problem. And that is what emerges in a crisis, right? That becomes conscious in front of people.
I am seeing a little bit of green shoots, I would say, of people really looking for that unity, I think, in meaningful ways. I was just reading, there was an author commentating on the Israel-Hamas war yesterday. She's a journalist, Julia Ioffe. I don't know if you follow her at all. She writes for Puck. And she was saying, I had to turn off social media. I had to talk to real people. I had to go read books. I had to read, articles by other journalists. That's an encouraging sign to me.
Well, Richard, a kind of a counterpoint to this, I mean, I would say kind of a complementary point to what you're making is a number of schools now, including Florida as a state, but many school districts are now barring cell phones from K through 12 kids at school. And in fact, there's one large school district in Florida that is now barring cell phones the entire day, much to the complaint of the teenagers and even the parents. But actually, most of the kids actually say, this actually isn't bad. We actually get to focus on stuff. But it's definitely a turning of people's perception about how you create community. It's no longer wanting to just sit by and watch the flourishing of this individualism of each person staring at their own phone. You know what I mean? That was sort of the 1990s idea that each of us could just have our own personal choices. We didn't need community. I think now that what I was saying before, the idea of how you actually forge community is actually becoming a conscious problem in America. We are actually beginning to think about how that is done in a way which we weren't before.
Definitely. All right. So, Neil, you've actually kind of gone into more detail around how crises unfold.
Yes.
You have this idea of like a precursor event that happens during the unraveling age, right? And foreshadows the crisis. So before the Depression, World War II, it was the U.S. involvement in World War I. And for the current crisis, it was the 9/11 attacks and the Afghanistan-Iraq invasions. So these were precursors that happened in the prior age, prior turning, but are foreshadowing something. What are they foreshadowing?
Well, they're foreshadowing the crisis to come, although they are not. They only represent temporary changes in the social mood. But they serve two interesting purposes. One is they socialize and acquaint with crisis the young adult nomad archetype, which will later be the midlife leaders of the fourth turning crisis. And it's fascinating to me that every single fourth turning, the leaders in midlife, whether it's George Washington or Ulysses Grant and Robert E. Lee, or whether it's Omar Bradley and George Patton, or you know what I mean? They always came of age during that earlier event, right? Before the Civil War.
Not a foreshadowing of what the crisis is going to be, but a sort of galvanizing or an alerting
for them.
It was start thinking about a crisis.
Exactly. And the other thing is it reminds us how suddenly a nation can galvanize into community. I think when people say it's impossible that anything today could possibly take America into a community, and I remind people, do you recall 9 months after 9/11 when George W. Bush had 94% approval rating?
I sure do.
So anyway, that's the precursor.
Okay. And then a catalyst event.
The catalyst takes you into the event. And the last two crises, it's been a global financial crisis. Obviously, the GFC, Black Thursday, 1929, that's quickly spread or coincided with Austria and a number of other places. And then earlier events would have been, the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession of the South. It would have been the Boston Tea Party, which, triggered the coercive.
So for us, the global financial crisis was really the event that said things are never going to be the same again.
Exactly. Yeah.
Ben?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this in terms of the way in which community, to Neil's point, can be built and built quickly and effectively. Because it strikes me that the story we tell now about the Americanness that emerged from 9/11 is not a story that's conducive for that happening again. It's getting me back to my question about, well, how does one get through the Great Ravine and elevate community values of the good sense? And I would increase that degree of difficulty by saying, how do you get through this Great Ravine and elevate community with the good ideals, and specifically those ideals of being an American, right? Which is important to me, right? I'm a patriotic guy and the like. And it is a degree of difficulty, and I think that degree of difficulty is increased by two not unconnected factors. The first is the story, what we all know that we all know about the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War in response to 9/11, that those wars were bullshit, right? That those were not, let's say, a necessary response to 9/11, that they were over to the side, both in their rationale and their execution. And, you're talking about the community building, we just have to turn off our phones and the like. I'm all for that. But I am reminded that this thing is the last thing I look at when I go to sleep, and it's the first thing I look at in the morning. And I don't think I'm alone in that. And the inundation of the messages and the stories that I get are to auto-tune me, to force me into either a red tribe or a blue tribe, which increasingly sees the other as un-American, as an enemy of the true America that their tribe represents. And so I look at these two factors, the stories we tell ourselves now about 9/11 and the Americanness that emerged from that. And I think the common knowledge is that those were mistakes. And I look at the tribalness of domestically and presenting the other side as evil. Not just mistaken, bad policy, but we're all Americans, we're all in this together, but is actually the antithesis of Americanness and un-American.
And let me take you back one cycle to World War I. And after World War I was over, we had the Spanish influenza. We had chaos across Europe, civil wars in Germany. We had, pretty soon we had fascist governments on the loose there.
Yep.
And America's attitude toward World War I was, to quote you, this is bullshit. Yep. I mean, and I think Robert Kagan, when he described America's reaction to World War II, kind of accurately said America's attitude was, Wilson lied, people died. That's how we remember World War I. And for the next 20 years, America turned isolationist, rigidly isolationist. We would not give weapons. We would not do anything for anyone, anywhere in the world. And in fact, it wasn't until 1940 that we would cash and carry Lend-Lease. I mean, we were so.
Right. Lend-Lease was a big deal. Right.
So,
I mean, it's yes.
And it was all the money lenders. They're the ones who got rich. I mean, it was a utter disaster. It did nothing. Anyway, so my point is this. It was not at all foreseeable that America would unite against fascism. And in fact, you can imagine other kinds of outcomes. We talked earlier about how history is unpredictable. What if Wendell Willkie had not been the Republican candidate who actually favored, arming for World War II, and actually, was FDR was very thankful to have that as a Republican opponent, and after FDR won, re-election in the fall of 40, that was a time when America was hugely rearming. I do think that was what I call the consolidation. I should say the kind of second catalyst in the book. It was the fall of France, which changed everything, right? Because with the fall of France, with Japan taking Asia, and we expected Germany's war with France would go on for years, right? It was no forcing thing, right? I mean, look what happened in World War I, right?
Yep.
And the fall of France was immediately followed by discussions that Britain might actually negotiate a truce of some sort.
Sue for peace. Yep.
So at that point, there was fear in America. And that fear overcame what until then had been the huge divide in American politics. And remember, I mean, you think that, today's youth are, disaffected into, red and blue zones. But back then, the best and brightest of Americans, many of them were card-carrying communists. They were followers of the Comintern. They were sworn in the pursuit of the destruction of capitalism and American institutions. Well, if anything, that's worse than anything I see today. Do you see where I'm going with this?
I do.
That was
I think it
also
relates to your ideas.
moment.
It relates to the regeneracy idea, right?
Exactly. And,
So
and
I've
it
got
would also
that here.
relate to how, I think Ben is right about this, about how uncertain the outcome is. How
Because like
uncertain
you were
it is
talking
which
about
way history is going.
the 2016 presidential election as being our first regeneracy in this crisis cycle. And at first I thought regenerate sort of must be a positive thing, bringing us together. But you're actually talking about how it's kind of dividing us. It's mobilizing party partisans.
It's fostering a new spirit of civic community, but not necessarily one community. And that's the thing I want to say.
But we do have engagement.
We do have
Kind of
engagement.
what you're saying.
And I often say, blame Donald Trump for anything you want, but you can thank him for taking care of apathy and voting, right? I mean, we now have voter participation rates that are higher than they've been in a century. No one complains about that problem anymore. That's what I'm talking about.
So I thought that was a very interesting point, and I love the way, Neil, that you sort of turn things on their head and all of a sudden things that seem to me very alarming take on a bit of a positive.
Yeah, but it is alarming.
It is alarming. Absolutely. I didn't say it's sweeping it under the rug, but still, it's interesting.
Because this is again my kind of person. I think it's disappointing. It's troubling when national politics take on outsized importance for our local lives, my view.
But they've done that every fourth turning, Ben. This is the rule. This is the rule.
Yep.
And Ben, you had a podcast recently where you were reviewing the media coverage, the New York Times coverage of the bombing of the hospital in Gaza.
Yep.
And you talked about a failure in duty of care of our leading institutions. And, you talked very passionately about it. So let's talk about it. How do you see that here? You're very troubled by this, obviously.
Well, it's part and parcel of what I see as that diminishment of care for duty, community, because that's what it means, I believe, to be part of a community, right?
To feel a duty of care?
Yes, exactly. That there are duties, right? And you can talk about that as responsibilities, but there are duties. And it's not duties in a transactional sort of way. It's a duty in the sense that in a reciprocal way, that as you treat others in your community as autonomous human beings, not as a means to an end, and you demand that they do the same for you. And what I think has happened both at individual level, but also at institutional levels, is a variation of the "I got mine, Jack" approach, right? That there is no longer a duty to the community values of we're all in this together, Americanness, but there is only action in service to that individual or that institutional goals, right? And it's a transactional layer to that seeps over everything. Absolutely. And is, I think, very antithetical to what I think are positive community values to be able to. It's just,
Yeah. I'm
it's just
curious what,
it's part and parcel of this great ravine fourth turning process. That's all.
and
It's not unusual. I can rail against it, but it is.
well, I do think and I'm interested in what Neil thinks here too, but this transactionality I know has always existed, right? But it does seem to me that it is, it's accelerated today. I have to imagine just the speed of communication that we have today versus, say, what we had 85 years ago, that this transactionality of everything has become, really, I suspect, more dramatic than it's ever been in the history of humanity. Neil, what do you think?
I think that the current of social events is always changed by blunt instruments, and it never looks pretty when it happens. So, look, we became a transactional society in the 70s and 80s, and you do anything for money, do anything for me, and we basically monetized journalism, we monetized everything.
And that was before the iPhone.
What?
That was before the iPhone.
Well, it was before the iPhone. It was well before that. But, and our antitrust policy, our regulatory, everything is just about, well, as long as it, the greatest good of the greatest numbers is a sum of market transactions. If that works, and you have obvious instances of, a limited number of things that can go wrong, well, then that's good. And the problem is that, of course, that leads to a society that ultimately, it leads to a society no one really wants to live in. And forces come the other way. And those forces are tribalism. And the tribalism never looks good when you first see it. As I say, it's a blunt instrument. It does not work, and it's not pretty to see it in operation. But it's doxing, it's canceling, and it's all this horrible stuff we see. And that's how new communities are created. Some people think that new communities are created in some very pretty process. Like we're all beautiful. We all just sort of, gradually hum together and so on. No, it's a horrible, brutalizing process. Wow. And it gets a lot of people to say, okay, I'm going to keep quiet because I just don't want to get shouted down. I don't want something bad to happen to me. It may not be in my personal interest, but I better not actually do that extra little thing for profit because someone's going to kill me, right? Or I'm going to be flamed. It's going to be, in other words, there are other motives. This is how community reasserts itself. It's a crude and pretty miserable process when you see it in action, but it was no prettier in earlier times, right? And I think that's what we're seeing.
Interesting.
Let me toss something out for you guys, because the only places where I've seen community building occur in a pretty, not necessarily safe, often fraught, often difficult, challenging, all those words, but not in a brutal sense. I've seen communities form around exploration. I've seen that happen in history. I've seen that happen in my own life, that individuals come together to explore a topic, an idea, a project, or the like, and that again can be challenging. It can fail. But that experience, I find, is a community building one of akin to, not having experienced organized political violence, but it's a powerful community builder. And my question, it is a question, are there avenues, the world has been discovered, right? I mean, there are no manifest destiny physical frontiers, I don't think.
There's Mars.
I want to leave that alone. Is there the possibility for exploration at scale that can build communities that make a difference for the preservation of the I'll call it the small L liberal virtues and the small C conservative virtues that I hold important?
Well, I would say actually, I think one thing that succeeds as we move from the fourth turning to the first turning is actually the redirection of community effort away from conflict and toward the conquest of other societies or other tribes, and toward the conquest of nature and the conquest of ignorance. And if you look at the section where I talk about first turnings and where America's going to go and where these how these first turnings have gone before, that has always been a huge theme, right? Of first turnings is institutions are very strong, but they still have tremendous energy, right? So what do? They want to conquest space, nature, territory, knowledge, everyone working together as a team. That's typically where the community energy of a fourth turning is diverted, right? We certainly had that during the American High. We had that after the Civil War with the exploration of the development of manufacturing and science and we certainly had it after the kind of the Jeffersonian era, where we had the Lewis and Clark expedition was considered an incredible event in its time. Just turned around Thomas Jefferson's reputation in an otherwise terrible second term when everyone hated him. But my point is that these do become unifying themes, but they can only become unifying when a society is already unified. They are not unifiers,
That's a good point.
Good.
That's a good point.
So let me just step through and try to bring us to an opportunity to close. But the other stages that we haven't gone through, according to you, Neil, in our current crisis chronology, is the consolidation phase, where everyone understands their community is engaged in a true struggle for survival. We haven't had our Pearl Harbor moment generationally. No. The spirit of America, as you've called it, hasn't awakened.
And in fact, we may not have had our second regeneracy yet. In other words, there are things we haven't had yet. I think we pretty clearly have one regeneracy. 2016, I believe, is the beginning of a political realignment. Every crisis and awakening, we have a political realignment in America. And I believe the Trump, Clinton political realignment of the two parties, less than before around class and more around education. And by the way, I will note that political scientists are beginning to call this period that we've been in since 2016 America's seventh political realignment. I've noticed in some of the new political textbooks are actually giving it a name, which is, right on cycle for me. And it's kind of where I hinted we were going. But we may well, and I suspect we will have another regeneracy, a movement, a shift, like we did in 1940 that actually came well before 1941. But ultimately, yes, we will have a consolidation. That will be a white knuckle moment. You know what I mean?
And then after the consolidation comes the history's equivalent to raging typhoons sucking all surrounding matter into a single vortex of ferocious energy.
Yeah, where everything becomes, all problems become more part of one big problem. Right. And there's a great simplification to this. If you took a look at people at the peak of World War II, it was that if we solve this, we now have the energy to solve everything, because everything's in flux now. We're refashioning all institutions, and we can solve the global trade problem and national competitiveness, and we can solve global technology problem. And there's this tremendous hubris that comes in the act of this collective struggle, which is unleashed. And then, of course, yes, the climax is when that the crisis has been solved one way or the other. I mean, crisis can either won or lost. I believe that was probably in the summer of 1944 with simultaneous invasions, massive invasions, both in the right after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, simultaneous with D-Day. Unbelievable that one nation could have managed in two separate areas of the world, each of them the largest invasions that had ever been, executed in history. And then finally the resolution, and that really closes out the era, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're sort of familiar with that.
Yep, good. And then we've talked about kind of where we are in this crisis. You talk about possible paths forward, including civil war or a great power war. I'm going to skip over these a bit because I think we've talked about them quite a bit. We've talked about the first turning high. Society gathers around a new sense of solidarity and direction. People want to gather, nest, procreate, and build, and cooperate towards greater order and cohesion. And then you've both also talked about investing in the real and rebuilding the real world as themes for the future. So
the material world, and
the material world.
There's been a lot of emphasis over the last, 2.5 decades on the experience economy. I think we're going to go back to the material economy, and we already see that, for instance, in weapons and arms and so on. The biggest gainers on an otherwise pretty troubled period on the S&P has been defense stocks. I mean, for instance, recently. But we're also seeing it in materials is actually a section of the S&P, as you may know, probably the unsexiest companies in the S&P, the ones who have the lowest PEs traditionally. This stuff may come back because these fourth turnings tend to be voracious consumers of materials as we try to remake the world, as we try to undertake campaigns against fellow communities. The last fourth turning, we saw the co-prosperity sphere set up by Japan, and America was over here, and Hitler was invading Russia to get oil, and there's a real hunt for materials during this period. I
liked the Steve Eisman was recommending or mentioning Vulcan materials. He said they make rocks.
There you go.
Ben?
Yeah, for me, investing in the real has a slightly different meaning. I mean, I agree with everything with what you're saying on the macro, but for me, investing in the real is moving away from the casino, the cartoonification of investment that you find with public markets today, and moving towards more local. For me, investing in the real, and I have a wide conception of what real is, but it's with real cash flows derived from making real things for real people, and owning a having a partial ownership share in those cash flows. What investing used to mean, which is so different from investing in a symbol of VMC or whatever your symbols are.
Branding.
Materials.
I think one conclusion I've made is that the sectors of the American economy which have slowed down the most dramatically in terms of productivity, just output per labor hour, are all the sectors that have a community dimension. I mean, you just think about it. Healthcare, right?
Yeah.
Finance, where we're all investing together in various kinds of insurance and so on. Social services, public relations, construction, which is a terrible, productivity record, land use development, community development. And you go through these and, you're rapidly up to about 50% of GDP. And the reason why young people feel that standard of living is not growing is not because they can't paper their walls with more flat screen TVs and all these individual products, like our cell phones, right? I mean, in other words, that's all retail to individuals, right? That's our individual economy. That's doing fine. You can continue to make great gains in that. But anything that involves us as a community, healthcare is the most notorious example, because I think that's 18%, 18 plus percent of GDP. I argue it actually has negative productivity change over time. We're obviously getting less healthy, even as we spend more and more money on it. It's a colossal failure. And so these are the things that require fourth turning solutions. So I come back to the idea of the fourth turning. We need to shift how we work as a community to solve healthcare. It's not going to be solved by, a new CAT scan, or a new kind of technology, a new way of operating on your spine or something. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a completely different way of organizing public health with personal health in a way that totally reorients what healthcare is about in this country.
So, Neil, going back to Ben's question at the beginning, do you see a path forward to doing that without it coming to deadly armed conflict?
I don't know. I officially remain agnostic on that because, like Ben, I mean, look, I tell people historically, total wars have always coincided with fourth turnings. When we have 7 instances of them in the Anglo-American perspective, many instances abroad. But I like to be hopeful. And so I remain open. I refuse to say that, well, it must. I mean, that's kind of stupidly pessimistic and doctrinaire. But I'm a realist. And I think, you prepare for what, may well need be required. I mean,
and I appreciated one thing you said too.
We know many instances in nature where these things are required. Without a forest fire, the pine cones on many of these redwoods will not germinate. It requires extreme heat for them to germinate. I mean, I'm just saying that nature is filled with cyclical processes that require certain things to happen. We may not like that, but I don't know. I'm agnostic.
Well, I know that you both have expressed an appreciation of community in your own lives and paths and activities. Neil, you were just telling me you moved to West Virginia. Ben, I know how much you value your Epsilon community.
Yep.
I mean, at a minimum, it seems like we can invest in community ourselves and maybe preempt some of the conflict that maybe avoid some of the conflict that in the past has needed to happen in order for people to value community again.
Or at the very least, navigate this period, even if it does require this, navigate it better.
Navigate it better.
And very often
That's why cycles matter.
Well, early decisions made in a timely way can sometimes prove to be very important.
Yeah.
There's so many of these strategic decisions that were made. I've been pointing out, if it hadn't been for FDR's support of the Vincent II Navy Act in I believe it was June of 1940, that actually led, finalized the laying down of the keels of the Essex class carriers and the Iowa class battleships, we wouldn't have had anything in the Pacific in 1943. We were down to Guadalcanal. We were down to like 1 aircraft carrier. And what would we have done in the rest of the war? In other words, we forget that, right? We forget that these timely decisions that were made actually made huge differences. And so a lot of it is making sure we excel in our performance during this period. It's. I don't think you can not have a fourth turning. I think it's here, whether we like it or not. But the decisions we make, wise decisions, pragmatically informed decisions, allow us to get through with it with much less pain and strife than we otherwise would require.
Nice.
Yeah, the only thing I can add to that, well put, statement is that I believe that building and being effective for communities, for example, a community to study cycles, right? It's important not just because it makes an instrumental difference in the path that we as a people, as humanity, as a nation takes through the fourth turning. I also think it's intrinsically what leads to a life well lived on an individual level. Mm-hmm. So both on that instrumental, it does impact the path, but also on an intrinsic, look, this is what makes us human, those connections. I think this is absolutely the path. This is the process. It's not an answer with a capital A, but I think it's absolutely a process.
So when I look back on just exploring this, getting ready for this conversation and really immersing myself in your book, Neil, what's really standing out to me is like I've kind of been reluctant to embrace the idea of a crisis because like you don't want to be a pessimist, right? Or try to market fear. But yet it's like, no, we are in a fourth turning. We can't like put the blinders on and pretend that that's not happening. It's so clear it's happening. Nobody wants to stay on the trajectory that we're on today, right? And yes, we can hope to, not have it be total war and work towards that. But ultimately, we do have to recognize that we really are in a crisis and that we have to respond. And the sooner we respond, the better.
Yeah, Richard, it's interesting because, for many years after the 1997 book, The Fourth Turning, people thought of it as, it's just horrible news, so pessimistic, this apocalyptic stuff that's going to occur way out there in the 2020s or whatever. And then now that we're in it, everyone thinks that my message is actually pretty positive because everyone knows they're in it.
Exactly.
We actually get to the end of it, right? And so to me, it's kind of curious, right? Suddenly it's the same message. There's nothing really fundamentally different about what I'm saying. It's people look at it differently.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, gentlemen, it's been, there were some Q&As that we're not going to get through, but thank you very much. It's been fantastic. I can't recommend Neil's book highly enough and Ben's community highly enough. And Ben's writing. You can sign up and get a couple articles for free at epsilontheory.com. So
just mention, Richard, we have we do our writing on Substack. It's called Demography Unplugged. So if anyone wants
Demography Unplugged. And I believe you have a link to that at fourthturning.com. Right?
Yes, they can go there. Yeah.
So, well, I hope we can do it again sometime, gentlemen. It's been really great. Thanks for setting this up, Ben. And thanks both for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, and for the success of your foundation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a work in progress, but I think we are making good progress. And I hope that we can talk again, Neil, and go more in depth into, your cycles theory and the secular theory, the saculum, because I think the audience would be really interested in more detail there.
Excellent. All right.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you, gentlemen. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.